The silence on Defiant was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of Earthmate transports landing with cargo, crates of medical supplies, solar panels, water filtration systems, and foodstuffs. The once glorious capital of the Zekthar, now a ghost city, stood in stark contrast to the bustling metropolises of the human homeworld. Towering spires that had once been symbols of intellectual might lay crumbled in the streets, their peaks turned to dust. Defiant, a planet once rich in culture and history, was now a husk, its inhabitants scattered, divided, and broken. Captain Jonah Parks stood before a crumbling statue in the city's central square. The monument had once honoured the Zekthar's role in founding the Galactic Concord, a peacekeeping alliance meant to bridge the gap between countless species across the stars. Now its face was chipped, its limbs cracked. The inscription beneath it, once filled with hope and unity, now read like a faded memory. In peace, we stand united. He exhaled slowly, taking in the gravity of the task ahead. The UEA had chosen him, selected him for his experience with high-stakes diplomacy, with navigating the fraught politics of galactic relations. But no amount of training could have prepared him for this. He wasn't just trying to rebuild a planet. He was trying to rebuild a people, restore their hope, their faith in the very concept of interspecies cooperation. Across from him, the first group of Zekthar delegates emerged from their underground shelter. They were led by High Counselor Ikad, a dignified figure despite the dirt and dust clinging to his robes. Ikad's eyes, once sharp with the brilliance of an ancient race, now looked weary, like someone who had lived through too many betrayals. "We have received your message," Ikad said, his voice thick with distrust. "But you must understand, Captain Parks, that it is not just your aid we need. It is something more, a chance to redeem ourselves. And not everyone in our people is ready to accept this." He gestured to the small group of Zekthar standing behind him, their faces stoic, their eyes veiled in suspicion. Jonah nodded. "I understand, Counselor. But the UEA is not here to dictate your future. We're here to help, and we'll leave that decision in your hands." Behind them, the Zekthar watched cautiously as human engineers unloaded crates of medical supplies. The distrust between the two species was palpable, and Jonah could feel the weight of it bearing down on his shoulders. As the initial awkward silence stretched, a figure broke through the crowd, an older Zekthar woman with silver-grey skin and thin, trembling limbs. Her voice was sharp as she addressed the Ikad. "We've heard nothing but lies, Counselor. They're the ones who abandoned us. All of them. The Vectar, the Predum, the Talari, they've all turned their backs on us. Why should we trust these humans?" Jonah stepped forward, meeting her gaze. "Because we're the only ones who didn't turn our backs. We're the ones who believe in a future where every species deserves a chance, even after everything that's happened." The Zekthar woman fell silent, her anger momentarily dimming. Ikad looked at Jonah, a flicker of something, uncertainty, hope, crossing his expression. For the first time since their arrival, the Zekthar seemed willing to listen. The Zekthar's capital was little more than a ruin now, but in the weeks following their arrival, Captain Jonah Parks and his team began to see signs of life. Small, fragile efforts to rebuild, often in defiance of their own people's despair. The human engineers worked tirelessly to restore power to the fractured grid, lighting up portions of the city that had been dark for years. Medical teams, led by Dr. Rachel Hayes, set up makeshift hospitals, using every bit of technology they'd brought to treat the survivors suffering from malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma. Yet, for every success, there were setbacks. Every small step forwards seemed countered by bitter divisions within the Zikthar themselves. There were those who accepted the human assistance as a necessary evil, grudgingly willing to work with their supposed enemies in order to survive. And then there were the radicals who rejected humanity's presence entirely, believing that the UEA's help was nothing more than a calculated strategy to weaken their people, to control what was left of their once proud civilization. In one of the newly rebuilt districts, Jonna stood next to Ikad, watching as Zikthar and human workers laboured side by side, their mutual distrust barely hidden beneath professional masks. The scene was hopeful, but Jonna couldn't shake the sense of fragility in the air. "There are many who resent your presence, Captain," Ikad said quietly, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the workers. "But I see something in your people, something I have not seen in any of the other races who abandoned us. You are sincere. You have no other reason to be here." Jonna shrugged, not sure if it was a compliment or an observation. "We're here because we believe everyone deserves a chance to redeem themselves." "That may be true for you," Ikad replied, his tone flat. "But redemption is a hard thing to ask for when the very people who once called you allies now see you as anathema." Jonna's gaze drifted to the distant horizon where dark clouds loomed. Ominous, a fitting metaphor for the galaxy's reaction to the Zikthar's fall. The other species had cut all ties. The Predum, with their sharp minds and razor-edged diplomacy, had offered nothing but condemnation. The Tanari, whose peaceful nature had once been their defining trait, declared the Zikthar unfit for interaction. And the Vectar, calculating and ruthless, used every means at their disposal to bury the truth of the Zikthar's innocence. "The galaxy's turned its back on you," Jonna said, voice barely above a whisper. "But we didn't." Ikad nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And for that, we will never forget you, Captain. But you must understand, we have enemies. Many of them are still here, hidden in the shadows, manipulating the remnants of our people. And there are those who will not forgive you for helping us." Jonna knew that this would be the hardest part, their biggest test. The human presence on Deshan was a fragile thread holding together a fractured world, and there were many who would do anything to snap it. But what they didn't know, what neither Ikad nor the galaxy realized yet, was that the greatest threat to the Zikthar wasn't from without, but from within. Late one evening, as Jonna prepared to leave for another round of meetings, his communications officer, Lieutenant Sarah Klein, called him urgently. "Captain, you need to see this," she said, her voice tense. Jonna walked over to our station and looked at the screen. On it was a news broadcast, an intercepted transmission from the Vectar. The message was clear. A full-scale propaganda campaign was underway, and the Vectar were planning to frame the Zikthar for a second wave of atrocities. "Get me Ikad," Jonna ordered. As the Zikthar councillor appeared on the screen, his face taut with worry, Jonna spoke with quiet urgency. "The Vectar are making their move. We don't have much time." Ikad's gaze hardened, his voice cold and firm. "We must act quickly, Captain. The truth is a weapon as powerful as any fleet." But Jonna's instincts told him that this wasn't just about the Zikthar's survival, it was about far more. Something far deeper was happening, and the galaxy had yet to realize that the truth was far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The next few days were a whirlwind. Jonna and his team scrambled to make sense of the intercepted Vectar transmission, but every piece of evidence they uncovered led them to the same disturbing conclusion. The Zikthar had been framed. The genocide that had destroyed their reputation, shattered their alliances, and left them stranded on the edge of the galaxy, was a lie, a well-orchestrated deception crafted by the Vectar to rid themselves of a political rival. Jonah sat in his quarters, reviewing the encrypted data on the stolen disk with Lieutenant Sir Klein. The images were clear: communications logs, intercepted transmissions, and video footage from a private Zikthar diplomatic meeting that had been twisted and edited into a damning portrayal of the Zikthar as the architects of mass murder. But what struck Jonah most were the shadows, the nameless, faceless figures lurking in the background of the footage, the ones who had manipulated the scenes to fit a narrative of genocide. The Vectar were the ones who started this, Sarah said, leaning over Jonah's shoulder as she typed in more commands. But why go this far? What did they stand to gain? Jonah rubbed his eyes, exhaustion starting to set in. He had a theory, one he wasn't sure he wanted to voice aloud. The Zikthar were the key to the Galactic Concord. They helped form it. And with them out of the picture, the Vectar have free rein to manipulate the galaxy. The more the other species believe the Zikthar are dangerous, the easier it is for the Vectar to expand their influence. A voice crackled through the comms, pulling Jonah from his thoughts. "Captain Parks, we need to talk." Jonah's gaze snapped to the screen. It was Ecad. "We've got a problem," the Zikthar leader said, his face pale and drawn. "We've received word that the Vectar are organizing another strike. A covert operation. They're going to frame us for another massacre, this time on the colony moon of Pallas 9. Jonah's heart sank. Pallas 9 was a small mining outpost, one of the few remaining places where Zikthar civilians still tried to make a living. The Vectar would have no problem manipulating the situation. The timing was too perfect. If they could use another fabricated atrocity to rally the galaxy's condemnation, the Zikthar would be irreparably destroyed. "How sure are you?" Jonah asked, already moving toward the door. "We intercepted a Vectar fleet moving toward the moon," Icard replied grimly. "They planned to make it look like we attacked a civilian settlement." "We can't let them get away with this," Jonah said, determination rising in his chest. "If we expose their plan, we might be able to prevent it." But Icard hesitated, the weight of their fragile alliance pressing down on him. "There are factions within our own people who want this war to happen, Captain. They think it will restore our honor. They want to strike back, no matter the cost." Jonah's eyes locked onto the Zikthar leaders. "Then we stop them. Together. You have to trust me on this. If we don't act now, the galaxy won't just abandon you. They'll wipe you out." The silence on the comms stretched for a long moment before Icad spoke again. "We trust you, Captain. Do what you must." Jonah turned to Sarah, who was already preparing the fleet. "Get me the UEA command. I want every available ship in position to intercept the Vectar before they can stage their attack." The urgency in the air was palpable. This wasn't just about saving the Zikthar anymore. If they didn't expose the Vectar's lies, it would mean the end of any hope for intergalactic peace. Jonah knew the galaxy would never forgive the Zikthar, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could win one final battle for the truth. And if they did, the humans would stand by them, no matter the consequences. The UEA fleet assembled in record time, a testament to humanity's efficiency and unwavering commitment to their allies. Captain Jonah Parks stood on the bridge of the Talon, his gaze fixed on the vast expanse of space stretching out before him. The fleet was ready, but Jonah could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. If they moved too quickly, they risked provoking a full-scale war. If they hesitated, the Zikthar would be blamed for the massacre the Vectar had planned, and their reputation would be shattered beyond repair. "We've got one shot at this," Jonah muttered under his breath, eyes flicking between his officers. "If we don't stop them now, we lose everything." The message was clear. They had to intercept the Vector fleet before it reached Palace 9. If the Vector executed their plan, it would not only destroy the Zekthar's last hope for redemption, but it would also throw the galaxy into chaos, with every species turning against the Zekthar once more. Lieutenant Sarah Klein's voice broke through Jonah's thoughts. "Captain, we've got a direct course for Palace 9. The Vector fleet is moving fast, but we can outpace them. We'll be in range in 2 hours." Jonah nodded. 2 hours. That's our window. Prepare the fleet for a full intercept. As the ships powered up, the tension on the Talon was palpable. Jonah could feel it in the air, thick and heavy. The Zekthar were watching, waiting for the humans to deliver on their promise. But there were more than just the Vector's forces to consider. Within the Zekthar themselves, factions of extremists and war-hungry radicals had begun to stir. Jonah had been briefed on the growing internal unrest. Ikat had warned him that some Zekthar were prepared to take matters into their own hands if they felt the humans weren't acting quickly enough. "This is not going to be easy," Jonah said to his second-in-command, Commander Alex Thompson, as he leaned over the console, eyes scanning the fleet's formation. "We're not just up against the Vector. We're up against their entire system of manipulation. If we don't stop this, we'll be painted as the villains in the galaxy's eyes." "I know," Thompson replied, eyes sharp. "But we have the truth on our side, sir. We just need to make sure the galaxy sees it." Jonah couldn't help but feel the weight of his words. Truth. It seemed like such a fragile thing, so easily twisted and buried by those in power. And yet, this was their only weapon. The fleet dropped out of FTL just outside the orbit of Palace 9. The planet loomed large before them, its surface dotted with the mining operations that had once given it prosperity. Now it was little more than a target, a place to frame another atrocity. Jonah could see the ships ahead, their silhouettes sharp against the blackness of space. The Vector fleet was already in position. "This is it," Jonah said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "All ships, prepare to engage. We need to disable their fleet without firing on Palace 9 itself. We can't risk damaging the colony." "Understood," Sarah's voice came through the comms. "Engaging now." The Talon surged forward, its weapons systems powered up and ready. As they closed the distance, Jonah watched the Vector ships move into formation, the same calculating precision that had made them one of the most feared races in the galaxy. They weren't just preparing for an attack, they were preparing to set a trap. And that was when Jonah saw it, a faint but unmistakable signal. A burst of static, a distress beacon originating from within the Vector fleet. "No," Jonah whispered, eyes narrowing. "It's a diversion. They're trying to pull us off course." 1,000 thoughts ran through his mind in a split second, but one thing was clear. This mission was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The Vector weren't just going to let the humans intervene without a fight. They had plans within plans, and the clock was ticking. "Pull back," Jonah ordered, but it was too late. The first volley of energy blasts came from the Vector ships, lancing through space like lightning. The battle for Palace 9 had begun. The battle erupted in an instant. The first Vector salvo hit the human fleet with devastating precision, sending ripples of energy across the vastness of space. Jonah barely had time to react, his heart pounding as the Talon rocked under the shockwave. The screens blinked red with damage reports, but his crew's discipline held. This was the moment they'd been training for. "Shields holding at 70%, Captain," Lieutenant Sarah Klein reported, her voice a steady anchor amid the chaos. "Weapons online, ready to engage." Jonah didn't need to hear the details. He'd been in enough battles to know what this meant. The Vector weren't just attacking. They were pushing hard, trying to force the humans into a corner. "Return fire," Jonah ordered, voice cold with resolve. "Focus on their lead ships. Disable. Don't destroy." The Talon's guns flared to life, firing precise bursts of energy at the Vector flagship. The enemy ship shuddered under the impact, but it didn't break. The Vector had long perfected their combat tactics, and their fleet was formidable. Jonah had expected a hard fight, but the enemy's unrelenting aggression only confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just a skirmish. It was part of a larger plan, one designed to keep the humans distracted while something more insidious played out in the shadows. "Captain, we've got incoming," Sarah said, her voice rising in alarm. "Another fleet, emerging from the far side of the moon. It's a trap." Jonah's stomach tightened as the second wave of Vector ships appeared. Massive, heavily armed warships designed for surgical strikes. They were positioned perfectly to cut off any escape or reinforcements. A large part of him had suspected this was coming, but the timing was perfect. The Vector knew they'd have to act quickly or risk exposure. They needed to keep the humans occupied long enough to finalize their real plan. "Commander Thompson, divert our fleet to engage the second wave," Jonah ordered, his mind racing. "We need to keep them occupied while we figure out what the hell they're really after." "Copy that, Captain," Thompson replied, issuing commands to the fleet. As the Talon and the rest of the human forces began to maneuver, Jonah turned his attention to the larger issue, the diversion. There had been something off about the distress beacon earlier, something too calculated, too deliberate. The Vector were using the attack on Palace 9 as a smokescreen. But what were they trying to hide? In that moment, Jonah realized the truth. They weren't trying to destroy the Zekthar. They were trying to frame the humans. The real target was them. The Vector had orchestrated this entire attack to push the humans into the open, to force them into an aggressive position where they could be portrayed as the aggressors in the eyes of the galaxy. It was a dangerous gambit, but it was working. The Zekthar had long been vilified, and now the humans were quickly being painted with the same brush. "Captain," Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. "I've decrypted part of the Vector communications network. They're sending a transmission to the galaxy, an emergency distress signal. They're going to blame us for this, frame us for starting the war." Jonah's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. "Not if we stop them first." He tapped into the fleet comms. "All ships, hold your fire. We're not the enemy. Focus on disabling their communications relay now." Jonah's eyes burned with determination. This wasn't just a military operation anymore. It was a fight for the very soul of humanity's reputation. If they couldn't stop the Vector from broadcasting their lies, the truth would be lost, and the fragile hope they'd built with the Zekthar would be shattered. The Vector would do anything to win this war of perception, and if they succeeded, the consequences would be catastrophic. The humans weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their place in the galaxy. The Talon surged forward, cutting through the chaos, and Jonah's mind was already turning to the next step in their plan. They couldn't allow the Vector's narrative to take root, not without exposing the lies for the galaxy to see. But the cost of this truth would be higher than anyone could imagine. The Talon's weapons fired again, but this time Jonah's orders were clear. Focus on the Vector's communications array, not their ships. The battle raged on around them, but the human fleet's primary objective had shifted: stop the broadcast. Disable the signal. Prevent the galaxy from receiving the false narrative that would paint humanity as the instigators of the war. Jonah's mind raced as his crew scrambled to execute the new orders. He knew the Vectar would do everything in their power to push their version of the truth into every communication channel. One well-placed broadcast, and the galaxy would turn on them. The Zikthar would be lost, abandoned once more to their enemies. And the humans, they'd be branded as conquerors, warmongers, the very things they had fought against since the early days of the UEA. "Captain, we've located the Vectar relay," Sarah called out, her voice tense. "It's on the lead ship. If we don't take it down now, they'll have a signal out in 3 minutes. Jonah's jaw tightened. They didn't have much time. The Vectar flagship was positioned far from the front lines, just out of the human fleet's primary firing range. But it was vulnerable. If they could disable the ship's shielding, it would be a matter of seconds before they could target the relay. "Commander Thompson, we're going after the flagship," Jonah ordered. "Prepare a strike force to hit their communication systems directly. Disable their shields, but don't destroy it. We need that relay intact for the truth to reach the galaxy." Thompson gave a sharp nod. "Understood, Captain. We'll be in position in 30 seconds. The Talon surged forward, its engines flaring as it broke through the lines of Vectar warships. Jonah's mind was focused, every second a precious commodity. The Vectar were fast, their tactics ruthlessly efficient. They'd anticipated this kind of maneuver. Yet Jonah refused to let them win. He couldn't afford to. "Sarah, feed me the relay's coordinates," Jonah said, glancing over at her as he gripped the helm. She was already several steps ahead, her fingers flying over the console. "Coordinates sent," she replied, a flicker of resolve in her voice. "All we need is a clear shot." They were getting closer now. Jonah could see the massive Vectar flagship ahead of them, its dark hull gleaming under the distant light of Palace 9. It was an imposing sight, far larger than any human ship, with sharp edges and a sleek, predatory design. But Jonah didn't flinch. He had one mission: stop the broadcast. The Talon veered hard to the right, narrowly avoiding a volley of fire from a Vectar destroyer. Jonah's knuckles whitened on the control panel as the ship jerked with the evasive maneuver. A warning alarm blared, but they were so close now, too close to fail. "Locking on target," Sarah said, her voice low but intense. "We've got the relay in our sights. Disabling shot in 3, 2, 1. The Talon's weapons systems hummed to life, sending a concentrated pulse of energy toward the communications relay. The blast struck home with a brilliant flare of light. For a heartbeat, everything seemed to pause. Then the flagship's shields flickered and began to collapse. The relay went dark. "Direct hit," Sarah called out. "The relay is offline." Jonah exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They had done it. The signal was severed, the false broadcast silenced before it could reach the galaxy. But they weren't out of the woods yet. The Vectar wouldn't give up so easily. "Captain," Commander Thompson's voice came over the comms urgent. "The Vectar are turning all their firepower on us. They're going to destroy the Talon if we don't pull back." Jonah's heart raced. The flagship was disabled, but the Vectar would come after them with everything they had, now that their primary weapon was neutralized. "Get us out of here," Jonah barked. "Full speed, back to the fleet." The Talon jerked into motion as the ship turned, just in time to avoid another barrage of fire. Jonah's pulse hammered in his ears as they pulled back toward the safety of the human fleet. The Vectar's retaliation was swift and merciless, but the tide had shifted. The first step had been taken. The truth was still in play. As they fell back into formation, Jonah's mind turned to the next challenge. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Vectar might have lost this round, But they would be back with more lies, more manipulation, and now it was up to the humans and the Zikthar to expose those lies to the galaxy, before the galaxy believed them. The Talon had barely returned to the main fleet when the alert came through, an encrypted transmission from Ikad, the Zikthar leader. Jonah's eyes narrowed as he activated the comms, knowing something was wrong. The battle had just been a small piece of the puzzle. Now, it seemed, the real threat was emerging from within. Captain Parks. Ikad's voice came through, strained and urgent. "We have a problem. It's worse than I feared." Jonah leaned forward, gripping the console. "What's going on, Counselor? Are the Vectar launching another strike?" "No," Ikad said, his tone heavy with dread. "It's the Zikthar. There are factions among us, radicals who refuse to accept the fragile peace you've helped build. They are organizing an uprising. They believe that your victory today proves that humans are already the true masters of the galaxy." Jonah's stomach tightened. He had feared this moment would come. The Zikthar were not a unified people. Ikad had made that clear from the beginning. The internal divisions were deep, and some factions saw any human involvement as a betrayal of their pride. They had been pushed to the edge of extinction, and now some of them were desperate enough to fight back, against the humans, against the galaxy, and even against Ikad himself. "How many are we talking about?" Jonah asked, voice grim. "Enough to make things difficult," Ikad replied. "Their first target is the Zikthar capital on Defiant. They've already begun inciting violence among the survivors, planting the seeds for a full-scale insurrection." Jonah exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about the Vectar anymore. The real war had shifted. If the Zikthar fell apart from within, humanity's fragile alliance would shatter. Worse, if they didn't act swiftly, they risked losing all their progress. The Zikthar might once again be labelled as dangerous, and the galaxy would condemn humanity for their collaboration. "Damn it," Jonah muttered. "We need to stop them before this turns into a civil war." "Agreed," Ikad said. "I'm gathering all loyal factions under one banner, but I cannot promise the radicals will stand down. They're motivated by fear, Captain. Fear of being overshadowed by humanity. Fear of losing everything." Jonah clenched his fists. "We'll send a team to Defiant now. We'll help you restore order before this gets out of hand." "We can't afford another false flag, Captain," Ikad warned, his voice tight. "If the radicals get wind that you're intervening, they will accuse you of trying to dominate us. They'll make sure the galaxy sees it that way." "Understood," Jonah said, determination settling in his chest. "We'll be discreet. Our presence will remain under the radar for now. We'll only act if things escalate." He turned to Lieutenant Sarah Klein, his face set in stone. "Get a special ops team ready. We're going to Defiant." Jonah's mind was already racing through the logistics, stealth maneuvers, suppression tactics, and diplomatic strategy. If they didn't handle this carefully, their involvement could be twisted into further proof of the Zikthar's fall from grace. The radicals would exploit every opportunity to frame humanity as a threat. But if they let the Zikthar burn from within, the galaxy would write them off as unstable and unpredictable. The fragile peace they had fought for would collapse, like a house of cards. As he prepared to lead the mission, a quiet voice spoke at the back of his mind. Could this be the moment the Vectar had been waiting for? The chaos within the Zikthar would only benefit their plans. Jonah knew the Vectar would exploit any weakness, and an internal conflict among the Zikthar would be the perfect cover for their next move. And if the galaxy thought humanity was involved in the uprising, it would seal their fate. Jonah had to be careful. Every move from here on out was a gamble. Certainly. Here's the continuation of Part 8 Part 8, The Last Stand, continued The Talon hurtled toward Zicthar's homeworld, Deshan, the urgency of their mission pressing down on Jonah. Every minute counted. The situation was spiraling out of control. If the radicals on Deshan managed to seize power, the Zicthar would be thrust back into a war they couldn't afford, and the humans would be blamed for it. Jonah had to act swiftly, decisively, and most importantly, quietly. "Captain, we're entering the planet's atmosphere," Lieutenant Sarah Klein called out. "We've got 5 minutes before we're in range of their capital. Scanners show heavy activity, a lot of movement. Something's definitely going on down there." Jonah stood, his jaw set. "Prep the extraction team. We're going to make a quiet landing in the outskirts. Avoid major contact with the radicals. We don't need to start a full-blown battle down there." His crew had already anticipated his orders. They were a lean, efficient unit, and in moments, Jonah was joined by his hand-picked team. Lieutenant Sarah Klein, Commander Alex Thompson, and a few trusted members of their elite Special Ops squad. They were equipped with stealth gear, armed only with non-lethal weaponry for crowd control and suppression. They couldn't afford to escalate things, especially not with the eyes of the galaxy watching. As the Talon descended, Jonah's thoughts returned to the Vector. They had already used subterfuge and political manipulation to their advantage, but Jonah knew they would not hesitate to strike when the time was right. The Vector had proven time and again that they operated with ruthless efficiency. If Deshan fell into chaos, it would be the perfect distraction for them to initiate a larger offensive. The false accusations of human interference in Zicthar internal politics would be the prelude to full-scale war. Jonah's boots hit the surface of Deshan with a soft thud. The landscape around them was alien, though beautiful great, sweeping plains dotted with tall, translucent spires that shimmered under the dying light of the planet's twin suns. In the distance, smoke rose from the capital city, a clear sign that the radicals had already begun their campaign. "Stay sharp," Jonah muttered as they crouched low, moving through the tall grass. "If we get caught, this mission will turn into a bloodbath. We need to find Ikad and his loyalists, fast." They moved quickly, relying on their advanced camouflage and the cover of the landscape. As they neared the capital, Jonah's comm unit crackled to life. It was Ikad. "Captain," Ikad's voice came through, tight with tension. "They're close. The radicals are on their way to the palace. I'm trying to secure a safe retreat for my allies, but it may not be enough. If you don't intervene soon, we'll lose everything." Jonah's grip tightened on his weapon. "We're on the ground, Ikad. Hold on. We'll get you out." The plan was clear. Jonah's team would need to infiltrate the palace, extract Ikad, and secure the surrender of the radical faction's leaders. The radicals had their weapons, an army of disgruntled Zecthar soldiers and civilians who had been whipped into a frenzy by years of fear and oppression. They believed they were fighting for the future of their people, but Jonah knew better. They were fighting for their own power. As they neared the palace's outer perimeter, the first shots rang out. The radicals had spotted them. The sound of blaster fire shattered the relative calm of the countryside. Jonah's team dove for cover as the battlefield erupted into chaos. "Let's go," Jonah shouted, leading his team into the fray. They had no choice now but to fight their way through. As they pushed toward the palace, Jonah's mind raced. Time was running out. The Vector were no doubt watching this moment closely. If they saw any sign of weakness, they would strike. Jonah had to stop the radicals, keep the peace, and most importantly, ensure that when this was all over, the galaxy knew who had stood by the Zekthar when everyone else turned their backs. They were humanity's last hope for true intergalactic peace, and Jonah would be damned if he let it slip away.